you all. I'm very grateful that you all came out tonight and that we could have a discussion about the Everglades and maybe start thinking about the Everglades in different kinds of ways. I certainly also wanted to make sure that I send my most grateful thanks for the invitation from the Contemporary Art Museum, the Tampa History Museum, and also the Department of Anthropology who helped make my talk possible today. I also want to mention that the work from this book that I'm going to be talking about today was generously supported by research funding from the National Science Foundation, the National Park Service, and also the Florida Humanities Council. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe 30 minutes, about a book that I've written, Swamp Life, that came out recently. I'm going to give you some highlights from that research, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about the Everglades afterwards. I want to talk about stories first. Get some room here. My glasses on, my over 40 glasses. You know, we tend to understand, I think, history, our own history, as well as the history of the places that we call home, through the stories that we tell about those places. They make us come alive. They make those places have different kinds of meaning. Even places that we're not as intimately familiar with, it's the stories about those places that helps us know them. And so the stories I think we tell about places really matter. They matter because stories about the past actually shape the way in which we experience our present and the places we are in today. I mean, what would Tampa be without ideas about buccaneers, right? The Everglades is one of these really storied landscapes. It's an iconic landscape that is very complicated. The way we think about it is very complicated. It's all that we think of often as nature in its kind of most uncultivated stage. It's full of frightening reptiles, such as this alligator that a friend of mine as a photographer took for me. Botanical excess, there are swarms of mosquitoes, it's extremely hot, it's unforgivingly hot, in fact. It feels to us, I think, when we think about the Everglades, and most of us think about the Everglades as a kind of alien and impenetrable landscape. You know, at the same time, the ways in which we talk about the Everglades and the stories we tell about the Everglades, the Everglades is portrayed as this landscape that's extremely fragile and unique and in need of restorative interventions. And I've written about these topics elsewhere. But one of the things that these stories leave out, or is really ambivalent about, is the way in which people live in the Everglades at all. And for the most part, when we think about the Everglades, we only think about people in terms of their impacts on the Everglades. The ways in which people are sort of external agents that change the Everglades by draining the Everglades, by introducing exotic species like massive pythons into the Everglades, etc. But we don't have a real good sense of the Everglades as a human place, as a place that has a kind of humanity. In my own work, I've really tried to tell a different kind of story about the Everglades. And one of my goals in this book, Swamp Life, is to really evoke, in a kind of aesthetic way, evoke the Everglades as a human experience, and a particular kind of human experience. I started my research in the Everglades in the late 1990s. I began this project, Swamp Life, with an oral history that I did. I'm an anthropologist, and so when I use the term oral history, I'm really referring to a long-term interview project that I did with one man named Glenn Simmons, and he's in that photograph. He's the guy on the left, the younger guy on the left there. And Glenn was kind of an adopted grandfather to me. Both my parents were biologists that worked in the Everglades, and so I grew up in the Everglades, I grew up in their household. I would hang out with them in the summer when my mom and dad were doing field work. And when I got to be in my early 30s, he said he really wanted me to help him write a book. And so I thought, okay, I'll do that. And the book that I thought we were going to work on, and why I wanted to do that, was because at that point, he was in his 80s, And he had spent his life in the Everglades, and he'd grown up there, and he'd lived there for multiple generations. And I thought we were going to write a book about environmental change in the Everglades. So since the 1920s and 30s, how had the Everglades changed? Now, what shocked me, and recall, this is like a grandfather, like I lived in their house. I never knew that he had spent his entire life as a commercial alligator hunter in the Everglades. I didn't know that. And no one I knew that. I'm sure his wife knew that, of course. Why do you guys think that I wouldn't know that? Why would that be such a secret?
Illegal.
Yeah, exactly. So alligator hunting had been illegal since the 1920s, almost throughout Florida. Had been illegal his whole life, and had been certainly illegal, you know, he stopped in 1968 when federal law sort of changed the ways in which you could transport alligator hides across the state line. Yet, what I found in my research after interviewing him and then doing another decade of interviews with people like Glenn, who had supported themselves as alligator hunters in the Everglades, was that alligator hunting was really the cornerstone of kind of rural society in the Everglades. It was, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So, as I said, as I interviewed more and more people like Glenn, I was really at first interested in understanding what the Everglades kind of means to a person who's grown up and lived and sort of in the Everglades their whole life, particularly to alligator hunters who would spend weeks at a time in the Everglades backcountry. And I was interested in how that experience of the Everglades differed from our kind of ecological understandings of the Everglades. What could we learn from people who knew the place so intimately? And then over the years, my interest in this question really shifted from understanding just this perspective, the Everglades is a different kind of way of being in the world if you're a hunter, to understanding the processes by which this particular history and experience of the landscape becomes marginalized. So in other words, how is it that when we tell stories about the Everglades, we don't know much about people who live in the Everglades? How does that process happen? And how did the Everglades as a human experience become largely forgotten? I use in my book this term, the politics of nature, to talk about these processes by which certain kinds of stories get forgotten. We've certainly simplified the history of the Everglades in multiple ways, you know, including the fact that people have been living in the Everglades for 10,000 years, 5,000 years longer than the Everglades was the Everglades. And I know a lot about that, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but in my talk today I'm just going to focus really about the experience of rural hunters in the Everglades from white communities. So I use this term gladesmen to refer to Anglo, mainly Southerners, who moved down into the very tip, the frontier of southern Florida, into the Everglades in the mid-1800s. So most people who did sort of white rural settlers moved into the Everglades really after the Second and Third Seminole Wars. Gladesmen lived in marginal, rather isolated communities on the margins of the Everglades, as well as around Lake Okeechobee, and in the 10,000 Islands, which is on the western coast on the bottom. If anyone wants me to pull up a map later, I can. I'm not sure how well people know this landscape. So from these rural communities, Gladesmen supported themselves and their family primarily from Everglades resources. They hunted wild game, deer, ducks, wading birds, all kinds of wading birds. Ibis was a favorite, as well as turtles for subsistence, so for food. And then they hunted alligators, otters, and raccoons, as well as plumed birds for commercial purposes. Really, hunting was their only link to the cash economy for probably 50, 60 years. So in other words, they lived in ways very similar to how people live in wilderness areas all over the world. In my own work here, I've been focusing on interviewing former alligator hunters throughout the entire Everglades system. So from the northern end of the Everglades, which is really Kissimmee area, where Walt Disney World is now, all the way down to the very southern end. This is a picture of a man that I interviewed named Pete Whidden, who lives in the Corkscrew Swamp. His grandfather, Pete here is about 90, and his grandfather moved to the Corkscrew Swamp in the mid-1800s. And his grandfather, his father, and all his uncles and everyone in his family supported themselves by alligator hunting. He's actually holding a rod that people used to hunt with to find alligators through the swamp, the ground, because alligators build caves under the swamp plain, and so to find him, they poke through the swamp to try to locate that. So that's what he's calling it. He calls it his poke rod, which is a good name. My book Swamp Life really revolves around one particular place in the southern Everglades. It's a mangrove swamp, and here's a picture of it right there on the screen. And this swamp is called the Bill Ashley Jungles. The Bill Ashley Jungles was named for a gang of outlaws who robbed banks, killed policemen, made and sold illegal liquor, and hijacked run runners on the Gulf of Mexico. Now, what's notable about the John Ashley gang, who is the name of it, the Bill Ashley Jungles was named for the brother of the guy, was that they evaded capture for years, and they really taunted the police at every stage. They broke out of jail repeatedly every time they were incarcerated. They broke out of prison, and they also escaped several posses along the way. Their successful evasion from the law, their success, I guess, as a gang, was it due in part because of their knowledge of the backcountry mangroves. You know, they really could slip in and out of the Everglades because they knew that landscape so well. And so there's lots of parts of the Everglades that are kind of have stories about the Ashley gang. They were successful until, of course, their leader, John Ashley, was killed one night late in an ambush on a dark road near Stewart. Now, as interesting as their story is, and it is really interesting, I really became, I have to admit to you, obsessed with the John Ashley gang because there was a woman in the Ashley gang named Laura. And the press dubbed her the Queen of the Everglades. So in the 1920s, there were all these stories about the Queen of the Everglades. And this coincidence, the fact that her name's Laura, my name is Laura, really is the thing that kind of obsessively drew me to this project for about 10 years, probably, in ways that are unhealthy. But it also drives the narrative structure of my book. The book has a lot about the Ashley gang in there. This logic, this story about the gang kind of drives and propels the book as I talk also about more anthropological research about Everglades hunters. So I talk a lot of things in the book about different ways in which the Bill Ashley Jungles comes alive. From the ways people and animals stake claims to territory in the Bill Ashley Jungles, to the ways the state tries to constrain these territorial practices, to the role of the hide market in these relations. I write about gangs and camps and the experience of hunting, what I think of as a kind of the bloodshed and boredom that hunting really is. But what I'm going to do for the rest of my talk today is really just focus on one part of that, and that's about movement and movement through the Everglades and how movement through the Everglades really shapes the hunter's landscape in the Bill Ashley Jungles. Traveling the Everglades was always slow going, with seasonal changes to the landscape shaping the work of turning time into space. When the water is high, like it is in this picture, in the rainy season, the Everglades interior feels less like a river of grass and more like a sea of grass. To get around, hunters would glide across the glade plain in these flat-bottomed boats called glade skiffs, and they would pole through the interior swamps to hunt. Now, in all times of the year, coming into the mangrove country, like I showed you before, was inaccessible except by boat. So these boats were extremely important to how people moved and experienced the place. Those are some homemade boats there that two guys made that are using those right there. Hunters traveled through and across the Everglades using an established network of intersecting passageways. While these passageways certainly facilitated movement, I'm particularly interested in how traveling along these passageways became another way of knowing the landscape, a way, in fact, of recounting stories about the landscape. Glade boats, called skiffs, like the one I'm showing you, were generally homemade, cobbled together affairs, made out of discarded lumber or vegetable crates like that. And Skiffs Maneuverability came about because they were fairly narrow, only about 2 feet across, 2.5 feet across usually. But at the same time, they had to be really long to accommodate enough stuff for a couple of weeks in the backcountry. And so they were about 16 to 18 feet long. So a long kind of, I've tried to pull them before and I'm not that good at it. They're very, very, very shaky because they're made out of really thin plywood often now, and they're narrow and flat, so they don't have a lot of sit in the water. They have a lot more move across the water. But they would carry, as you can see in this one, big sacks of salt, a couple 100 pounds of salt that people would use to prepare hides when they're back in the wilderness. They would carry some tobacco, usually some meat that was cooked down and stored in lard, a little bit of water if they could take it, matches, hatchets, knives, machetes, things like that, and of course rifle and ammunition. You can see there's a little puppy in that one, in the bow of that boat, which I really like a lot. Glades hunters covered many miles a day in these boats. The routes these hunters used were hardly arbitrary. Instead, skiffers poled their boats through established passageways that formed tunnels through the mangroves, jungles, and snaked across the inland marshes. In some respects, these skiff passages were akin to a watery system of routes similar to a network of roads in any town or village. In fact, at places, these skiff routes would actually cross real roads, and people would talk about these as landings. These landings, though, were fairly invisible. They were marked usually by very subtle things in the landscape, a solitary palm or something, but though outsiders, including game wardens, they went unnoticed. The courses and intersections of these routes produced a conversation of sorts across the landscape. Routes and the landings were often named after the person who claimed them. So, for instance, Ed Brooker's landing at Whiskey Creek off the Old Ingram Highway, which is now in Everglades National Park, was named for an old-timer who lived permanently at a camp a bit back from the landing. Brooker was a mythic figure in the Glades. He lived there and moved into the southern Everglades in about 1904 after hunting otter and plume birds around Lake Okeechobee. People talk about him and they say Brooker would manage that area as if he was farming for deer. And what they meant then was that he would set these mangrove forests on fire, and which would attract deer to fresh growth when things came back. Sawgrass and water, like mangroves, are central facts of the Everglades. Sawgrass, which is technically a sedge, can grow to be up to 9 feet high, particularly in the northern end of the Everglades, in those rich muck soils. Sawgrass presents itself really as a thick wall of vegetation. While sawgrass's thick growth really limits the movements of all kinds of animals, including people, alligators use these sawgrass marshes for nesting during June and July, and that's particularly so in the southern part of the Everglades. So to reach these alligators, what hunters would do is they would walk hunt, as they called it, the glades, the sawgrass country. This entailed a constant grappling with the plant as walkers slogged and stumbled through water that could be anywhere from a few inches to several feet deep. Sharp, upwardly tilted teeth line the edge of the plant's blades. And when rubbed against, the blades leave painful cuts that are really notoriously difficult to heal. Most people wore clothes, of course, like this guy is, that covered their arms and legs, but exposed skin on the palms, on your neck, on your bare feet, and on your faces were almost unavoidably shredded by thousands of little cuts when you're in the sawgrass country. So gladeland mobility in this case involved multiple pauses along the way. Side trips, obstacles, switchbacks, and waiting. Like a dirge, waiting's a refrain that appears all through the stories that walk hunters tell. Pete Whitten, who I showed you that picture of him earlier, he used to hunt in the Corkscrew Swamp, and he describes waiting for an alligator to rise up out of his cave, out of the water cave. He says, "I have set for them as much as 8 hours." And he was there, because he come up They say they can't stay down there but 2 or 3 or 4 hours. But I know they can stay down, some of them 8 hours. They can hold that air that long, sure can. And 3 or 4 or 5 hours is very common. I have set for them. So throughout these long hours of waiting for alligators to come out of their caves, come up into the water, hunters had to remain as still as possible. Any movement or unusual sound would scare an alligator, and the waiting would go on. They wouldn't rise up. So really hunting in the sawgrass country and hunting in lots of part, there was this need for extreme caution that would transform even the subtlest movement into a kind of silent gesture. Lighting cigarettes, smashing off at a horsefly, stretching your legs, all quiet. So hunters waited for alligators in the rain when the sun was high overhead, and after nightfall they continued to wait. In this picture here, of course, people did whatever they could to hurry up that process. So one of the best tricks for getting alligators to come out of their caves is to mimic the sound of a baby alligator. And they use this term grunting, and it sounds just like a baby alligator. My little daughter can do it well. And miraculously, alligators will come to you as if you were the Pied Piper. That's what this guy's doing right here. He's actually making a little weird, it's a real nasal sound that I'm too embarrassed to do. But he's trying to bring up gators, because gators will eat their babies, so that's a sure way to get them. So we've been talking about mobility or movement, and how movement is a kind of essentially a process of displacement. Snakes I want to talk about as movement. While the movement we've been talking about is about displacement or moving through time and space, snakes in the Everglades have the power of dislocation, or to put it another word, why snakes really have the power to transform people to other worlds. E.O. Wilson described this potent magic of snakes when he said that a snake, quote, appears without warning and departs abruptly, leaving not a specific memory of a specific snake, but instead a vague sense of a more powerful creature. The Everglades teems with about 25 different kinds of snakes. Mangrove prop roots conceal coiled cottonmouths. Water snakes of many species and dispositions are all around through the mangroves. There are diamondback rattlers and coral snakes in the pine woods and on the hammocks higher ground. The appearance of snakes often interrupted the movement of people in the Everglades, and the possibility of snakes certainly shaped the way people moved. Glades hunters' gestural repertoire included things like watching your step, shaking out blankets, prodding the forest litter with a stick. Skiffers in their boats became adept at using their boat pole to just casually whip the snakes that fall out from overhead out of their boats. Everyone who has spent time as a hunter in the Everglades has stories about being bitten by snakes and about sort of backcountry emergency snake help or rushed trips to the hospital. So the movements of snakes intersected in multiple ways, and they shaped the way people move as well. Yet, encounters with unnaturally large snakes form their own kind of entanglement in the Everglades. Such phenomenal creatures feature throughout all the stories of the historic Everglades. So for instance, in 1897, the Miami Metropolis, which was the paper of the day, reported that Walter Ralston, who was described as a snake charmer of wide repute, captured a 12-foot boa constrictor at Black Point. Now, there was some snake mania going on in the region at the time, and apparently the capture of the snake did not do much to dispel this mania, because 2 days later, the New York Times also had a front-page article that described Ralston's quote-unquote death struggle with the serpent, but now the snake had grown from 12 feet to become a 33-foot python. That is some kind of good eating on the snake's part. Several years later, though, this same snake or another one, perhaps just like it, makes another appearance. In a report published in a Miami newspaper in 1896, Ed Brewer, who was a famous local guide and hunter, he witnessed what he described as a huge serpent. And he was taking out a party of kind of fancy city folks, including a Fort Lauderdale judge at the time. In the newspaper account that he describes this, what happened, he saw the snake lay in the water and its eyes projected a beam of bright and unworldly light. All the while, the snake was smacking his huge chomps. Now, because they were both afraid, I think, they were really paralyzed by fear. And of course, the snake had this kind of mesmerizing power, and I like to think maybe a little of whiskey's magical realism had a bit to do with this as well. They were unable to shoot this big snake. The following year, though, Brewer goes back to the same location, and he is successful, and he reportedly killed a very large snake there. Somehow, unfortunately, the snake's odor made Brewer pass out, and he wasn't able to retrieve the snake. What I'm trying to say, though, with these funny stories is that in the Everglades, snakes, both real and mythic, really shape the way people live their lives and what they do and how they move. They stake kind of claims on that landscape. And we'll get back to big snakes in just a second. We might understand these spatial practices that I've been talking about as strategies of territorialization, or how people make claims upon the landscape. Yet this claiming only goes so far because the landscape itself offers its kind of own counter-moves. The Everglades is a landscape that's in constant motion. It's a highly mobile landscape that resists the human world's efforts at staking claims. This is particularly true in the mangrove country. Rhizophora mangle, or the red mangrove, which is what we're seeing now, has roots that snake in all directions and extend as far as 2 meters from the tree's trunk. This kind of multiplicity of roots can elongate. The roots can grow up to 9 millimeters per day. If mangroves do not build land, as the early scientists thought, they certainly contribute to the building of land. This impenetrable tangle that is the root system helps silt stay put and creates these kind of land-building nurseries in the root systems. The silt and the land begins to accrue. All of this growing up and out and intertwining made skiff passage or movement through the landscape often impossible, and certainly the routes through the landscape were never permanent. So while a boat's way is its progress, the Glades way had to do more with making way, or the removal from obstacles for passage. Skiffers regularly pulled their boats through narrow channels for days on end, an activity that typically involved hacking and shoving through walls of mangroves, as well as fighting the wind and current in the open waters. On the less frequently traveled routes, and most of them were not super frequently traveled, as you can imagine, people would lay down in the boats and pull themselves through the mangroves, getting out, getting back in, getting out, and removing obstacles along the creek beds. In these really tough passageways, traveling a half mile would take several hours. In fact, the thing about these passageways through the mangroves, these main ways in which people would move and try to hunt, is that if you came back a year later, they would be gone. Mangroves go so quickly, and the passageways would be gone. And there's the name of there's an entire slough that's in the southern Everglades called the Wink-Eye Slough. And I never could figure that out, and then one guy told me, it's because the passageways close shut in the wink of an eye. So instead, for much of traveling in the Everglades was really kind of about the rediscovery of space. This is my last slide. Back to snakes. I want to end my talk tonight with a story about the Bill Ashley jungles. One day in the 1930s, my grandfather was hunting in the Bill Ashley jungles, and he was hunting with an old man named Wes Mobley, who was kin to one of the Ashley gang. The older man, they were pole hunting, so they were hunting from boats, and then they were getting out and walking in the Everglades hunting. It was winter time, and they were hunting for alligators in their caves. So what they would do is they would leave, my grandfather was a young guy at the time, 15 years old or something, And they would leave the camp in the early morning and they would split up this swamp. One guy would go one way and the other guy would go the other way, so they'd have more chance to, encounter more alligators. One time what would happen though is because it's so tiring to walk through these mangrove landscapes, at the end of the day, my grandfather, young guy, would get back on the trail of the old guy so he wouldn't have to break his own trail, and he'd walk back on that trail. Just for the last half mile. So Mobley never said much about this trail issue. But my grandfather knew that Mobley would not have approved of this double tracking. So one evening, as my grandfather was heading back to camp along Mobley's trail, he came upon the drag marks that looked like they were made by a mid-sized gator's tail going across the trail. But what's really stunning to him and horrifying to him was that there were no feet marks, claw marks along the side, which you'd expect to see. So later that night, he says to Mobley as they're around the campfire, he says, he asked him if he'd ever heard about any big snakes being in this part of the country. Because he says, he told me, everyone that ever knocked around the lower swamps has heard of large snakes hereabouts. So he asked that night Mobley about it, and Mobley said, why? Did you see sign of one? And when he said that, of course, my grandfather knew he'd been tricked. So from then on, he stayed off Mobley's trail, and then years later, somebody told him that he'd made that sign of the snake by dragging a log across the trail. So what I want to say, though, it's been decades since those magical, phenomenal snakes made their presence known to people in the Everglades, right? The park's done a really good job at claiming the landscape for other reasons besides hunters. But what's also interesting is that now we have these mythic snakes that have really resurfaced to make us rethink what the Everglades means once again. So here's a picture of a Burmese pythons. I'm sure you guys have all heard stories about these Burmese pythons in the Everglades, and they really are quite big. These are exotic imports, of course, that are now roaming the Everglades by probably 100,000, hundreds of thousands, but we don't really have a good number of it. They're one of the world's largest snakes. As you can see here, this is one of our research crew. We find them all the time. And we just found one. And they can weigh hundreds of pounds. You know, these snakes have returned to the Bill Ashley jungles. That's where those guys are. I wrote this book because I'm really hoping that other aspects of the hunter's landscape, not just these big snakes, can be reanimated as well. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Yes, sir.
I have several, but are Burmese pythons edible? Or
People do eat them.
people eat manatees too.
Right.
They're supposed to be very good.
I have not eaten one. I have known people who have eaten manatees, though. The fat is apparently quite lovely for cooking.
Yes. But I was just thinking, make a market. Make a
Well,
market out of them.
no, the market that is for pythons would be in their skins. I mean, python skin would be the market, I'm guessing. People, it's possible, but those exotic meat markets are never as, alligators, right? Alligator skin that we grow in alligator farms are great. And probably it's a better market for the skins than the thing. The tricky thing is for one thing, they're in the national park, and you can't hunt in the national park, so that's a little bit of an issue. The other thing is that the population has just exploded in ways that I think we're really unclear about. Even the number of snakes, what there are any ways to get rid of them. So it's a real problem. But I think you're right. Some kind of an economic incentive might help. What's your other question?
The other one's much more serious.
No, that's serious.
Why are the glades important? And I don't mean in a pejorative sense. It's a genuine question. It's a great living laboratory, things like that. But inherently, it's also a great water resource.
Certainly, yeah.
But beyond those two things, why is there the tremendous emphasis on rehabbing the glades?
On Everglades restoration?
Yes.
So I guess that's a really good question. Why are the Everglades important? And so if you asked an environmentalist, or you asked a scientist, or you asked a water manager, you're going to get a really different answer to that question. If you ask people who live in and around the Everglades, you're going to get a different question, right? You're going to get, a different answer that has to do with history and aesthetics and love for a place. You know, so I know why I love the Everglades, but I think often the reasons we hear that the Everglades is important, such as aquifer storage and recharge, etc., don't necessarily resonate with most people. But you know, certainly the restoration program, right, was WRDA was passed in 2000, the federal legislation, because of the water issue. Primarily, it's a water distribution or prop issue. But environmentalists have very different reasons for thinking it's important. Yes, sir. You.
Okay. Going back to something you hinted at the beginning of your presentation, what are the sort of driving forces you think that are leading to stories like the ones you are trying to preserve in your book, leading to those stories being marginalized or forgotten?
Well, I think that I think for one thing I think maybe in a way that your question kind of suggests that, is that the Everglades has been historically in Florida this landscape that we've talked about in really kind of oppositional ways. So you're an environmentalist and you're for kind of restoring and protecting rare animals and plants and kind of biota, or you are, you're interested in kind of the developmental possibilities of this landscape. And it's really created, I think, these lines in the sand that are not very helpful. But it also, that's one of the reasons I think that other more nuanced stories about like rural poor people, which are never really stories people are that interested in anyway, get kind of lost in sort of this bigger kind of politics of the Everglades. Yes, Becky?
Well, this is kind of building on David's question, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about class in your efforts of repeopling or humanizing the history of the Everglades, sort of connected, I guess, to where you
Yeah, I mean, I do think social class has a lot to do with the kind of stories we talk about when we talk about different kinds of places. And so when we talk about wilderness in general in the United States, we tend to talk about indigenous people, and we talk about that kind of history. We're much less comfortable talking about rural poor people and how they are impacted by our efforts at preserving wilderness. But you know, the stories of the making of parks throughout this country is a story where we preserve lands, and for very good reasons, but there's always going to be losers when we create national parks. People are displaced from those landscapes. And usually the people that are displaced are really much more vulnerable because they're poorer, they're uneducated, etc. And that's certainly a story about Everglades National Park. You know, I've been looking through the superintendent's reports since the park's establishment in the archives lately, and it's shocking how superintendents talk about these people who've lived for generations in the park who are suddenly asked to leave. You know, they talk about them as being drunk and sort of, you know, in these really negative ways, and stupid, and people who are just like raping the landscape and overfishing and killing everything, and without any kind of sense at all, I think, about how, in fact, certain kinds of communities pay a very high price so that we all can enjoy places like the Everglades.
Well, it goes along the same way. Actually, it's like the part two to that question. And it's, you know, we love to think of parts of Africa as wild. We love to think of Florida as wild. And yet, you know, when people like Daniel Boone, for example, lived off of the land, you know, years ago, we did think of that sort of as wild, but it made sense with, you know, the history of America. And I wonder if because Florida's always been so synonymous with the wild, that that this kind of thing then happened that way? Because, you know, we could think of the Rockies as wild, but we don't think of the Rockies or the West as wild the same way Florida is. And
I think that this idea of Florida as being wild is relatively new. I mean, to be honest, you know, if you read about what people were writing about the Everglades in you know, up until the 1950s, we were a country that depended on agriculture. Our national integrity depended on agriculture. The economy depended on agriculture, as it still does in Florida. And so people thought since statehood about the Everglades in terms of their productive ability for agriculture. So when Florida becomes a state, it enters the Union, the whole southern part is not, the whole Everglades is not part of the state of Florida. Because at that time, any lands that were kind of underwater, wetlands, were not ceded over to the states. Instead, the federal government had control until the states came up with a plan for drainage for agriculture. So I think our ideas, and this happened in wetlands all across the United States, but if you read the early statutes about Florida, some of the first laws the state of Florida passed were kind of mechanisms for figuring out ways to drain the Everglades. So these ideas, I think that though Florida is this, you know, wilderness place, is probably much more contemporary than, you know, probably, and particularly I think it's linked to kind of environmental consciousness and how that changes a little bit. Certainly scientists thought of Florida as like the last bastion of like kind of Caribbean research. Scientists who came down like John Small, those pictures that you showed earlier, they came here because it was like they could do field work on the Caribbean and the tropics without leaving the U.S. So it was really exciting, you know. But so there are scientists who are thinking about this place as wild and interesting. But I think for the most part, in the rest of the country, we're really thinking about this as a frontier for agricultural development. Certainly, my family who lived in Arcadia, who moved there in the mid-1800s, they were all about ag, you know. Yeah.
Two questions. I'm interested in historical fiction of Florida and the Everglades. Any recommendations?
Historical fiction about the Everglades. Well, you know, of course, the Peter Matthiessen books are really, really wonderful. You know, I don't know if you've looked at those before, but I would say those are the best.
Okay, second question is, what was the relationship between the white and the Native American or the Indian?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Seminole and Miccosukee people who moved down into the southern parts of the swamps just a little bit before, maybe like a decade or so before these white rural settlers, they had very similar hunting techniques. They used very similar and often the same buyers to buy their hides, so the same kind of market system. They would sell their hides at the same places, trading posts and things like that. There certainly was interaction between white rural hunters and white communities and Seminole Miccosukee people during that early time period. So it's really, most of the old hunters that I know, they speak Miccosukee, the language. So there's a lot of this interaction, but at the same time, it is clearly an imbalance of power. So, you know, during this time period, that like from the 1920s, the 1930s, 1940s, while you know, white hunters are increasingly hunting in bigger areas, buying up land and putting much more pressure on traditional Seminole Miccosukee hunting areas. But there is a lot more interaction, and it's a lot more messier relationship than we might think. Yeah, yes.
If I may, just for a minute, this is going to be a commercial, but I don't intend for it to be. But we have here at the History Center, we have a book group that meets the third Thursday of every month at 10:30 in the morning. And we have reviewed a number of books having to do with Florida history, many of which took place in the Everglades. Randy Wayne White has a whole stack of books
He's some beach reading.
in that area. And if you'd like to talk about it, if anybody would like to talk about it after the fact, the chair of our book group was in the past earlier, but she's not here right now. But so there's a lot going on here through the History Center, if anybody's interested in pursuing books of that type. Excuse the commercial.
I hope you guys read my book, it'll be fun. Yeah.
I was just curious how the housing or the habitation related to the swamp landscape. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so people lived in, so it just depends on where people lived. But people who lived in really isolated islands, in the 10,000 islands, and they often had big homesteaded sized properties, and so there would be one or two family living on a few 100-acre island. And often those were houses that they made initially out of kind of cabbage palm thatch. So very kind of temporary structures at first. And then, and what you can see if you ever have a chance to go out on those places where those old homesteads are, you can see spots where they've had big cisterns are still there, and you can see domestic flowers like roses and things that people planted. But the houses are all gone, I'm sorry, because they were.
So they weren't in the swamp, they weren't on stilts, or how did they relate to the swamp? Were they up on the houses?
Yeah, a little bit up on stilts, yeah, a little above. But just like, I mean, southern vernacular, architecture that's up a little bit that we see in South Florida, pine. People timbered a lot of pine, of course, so pine would, once you got a little money, people had little pine one-room shacks. Yeah, and also people repurposed boats often for, temporary houses. Yes, ma'am.
I had a question about your, at the beginning you kind of mentioned the power of stories. And I know in your book you talk a lot about how landscapes create that storytelling. But I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the silencing of people participating in illegal behavior, like Glenn Simmons, and being silent about telling the stories. And he wanted to come out and talk to you about the book. Is that sort of a pattern now where people aren't hunting anymore, but they're talking about it, and that's how they maintain sort of how the landscape is constructed in their own personal narratives?
I don't know, that's a complicated question I might not be able to answer. But what I can say, and I have a chapter in my book about this because I'm really interested in how people live their lives when their lives are kind of all underground. Right? And what that means about how they live in the Everglades. And so, even though alligator hunting was illegal, it was the primary economic engine for, households all over the place. So it was illegal, but yet it wasn't socially condemned. So within communities themselves, I mean, every family had alligator hides rolled up and stored under their beds, waiting for a guy to come around and buy them. Every family. Kids had them, everyone hunted. Now, so within communities, I think there's a difference between things that are sort of socially marginalized within your own community, and then these practices of kind of evasion from game wardens. And so this is really where we begin to see what happens when alligator hunting is illegal, that people spend all of their time thinking about how not to get caught by game wardens.
Well, I was wondering how it affects sort of how, since they're not doing the hunting anymore, or at least there's a much smaller incident of it now, how does it affect how they're kind of interact with the landscape currently?
Well, everyone that hunted alligators is really not around that much anymore.
Are they passing the stories on to their families at all?
I hope that things like this, and I wrote a book that came out in '98. That was the first book about this research, and it kind of spurred a little bit of a crazy Glades people heyday. And so now there's all these clubs and people in airboat clubs and things like that are really kind of using this identity in kind of a political way now as a way of kind of claiming rights to make decisions about Everglades. So so I think that in a way that stories do get repurposed as well, and identity stories get repurposed as well. And in this case, I think this kind of Gladesman identity in South Florida and Southern Everglades has really now become a kind of a way in which people can feel they have an authentic right to shape decision making about the Everglades.
moonshine, since you were looking for a book to write, moonshine in this end of the world, in this end of the state,
Yeah.
might be fine fodder for
Yeah.
many tales, stories.
Yeah,
that-
and we talk a lot about it. It was really, moonshining was really big in the Everglades too, because there's fresh water everywhere.
Sure.
There's wood everywhere. They're really remote. So, you know, so you had all those ingredients. And so, yeah, certainly through Prohibition, moonshining was really big. And in fact, people tell stories about being in really remote areas and yet hearing axes all night long. You know, that sound.
Okay, we're gonna close the event. One more question.
One more, sorry.
At the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that the Everglades have only been Everglades for the last 5,000 years, and I was just wondering if you could describe what it would have been like.
Yeah, I can a little bit, briefly, because that's a big story. But certainly, like paleo data and other kinds of data suggests that prior to about 5,000 years ago, the Everglades really did look different. For one thing, there was a lot more variation in climate. So there was periods of when it was really arid, and then there'd be kind of colder periods. And the water was at a different coastal level. So at that time period, one of the main differences, you know, from 10,000 years back to about 5,000 years back, I think, was variability in climate more than we've seen for the last 5,000 years, and that really did kind of shape the Everglades at what it looked like at the time. The other thing that we're just trying to figure out, and it's so interesting, I'm writing a paper with an ecologist named Dan Childers right now about it, is about tree islands in the Everglades. They think that, you know, we tend to think of tree islands in the Everglades as being these kind of static things that have always been there. And what's really interesting is they've got this new kind of soil data that goes down really deep that predates 5,000 years ago. And they think that prehistoric indigenous people who were living there at that time had a very active role in the creation of these tree islands. So I think there's a lot we don't know, but there's a lot we are figuring out right now.
Okay, thank you so much.